When a talk show host tried to undermine a self-made entrepreneur on live TV, he didn't expect the response to spark a national movement. The room was electric with anticipation as the cameras rolled, capturing the bustling energy of the live studio audience. Today's guest was no ordinary entrepreneur. Elijah Carter, a 38-year-old visionary from Detroit, Michigan, had made headlines for turning his modest tech startup into a billion-dollar enterprise. His story was the stuff of inspiration, a kid from a working-class neighborhood who had defied all odds to become one of the most respected names in the industry. Viewers across the nation tuned in, eager to hear about his journey. But the host, Richard Vaughn, had other plans. Richard was no stranger to controversy. Over the years, his sharp tongue and polarizing opinions had made him a household name. He thrived on creating uncomfortable moments, the kind that made his audience gasp and his ratings soar. Critics accused him of being manipulative, even prejudiced, but his loyal fans saw him as someone who spoke his mind, no matter how divisive. For Richard, today's interview wasn't about celebrating Elijah's success. It was an opportunity to challenge it, to chip away at the shiny narrative that had captivated so many. The stage was set, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Elijah, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, took his seat across from Richard under the glaring studio lights. He carried himself with a calm confidence, his warm smile and steady posture projecting humility rather than arrogance. Richard leaned forward slightly, his pen tapping rhythmically against his clipboard. The atmosphere was polite, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. "Welcome to the show, Elijah," Richard began, his tone light but with a trace of something sharper beneath the surface. "You've certainly been making waves lately. People can't stop talking about how you've revolutionized the tech world. But tell me, do you think the narrative about you is perhaps a little too perfect?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Elijah didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, tilting his head slightly as if considering his words carefully. He adjusted in his seat, glancing briefly at the audience before turning back to Richard with a steady gaze. "Well, Richard," he replied, his voice smooth and measured, "I think it's less about perfection and more about perseverance. My journey hasn't been easy, but I believe hard work and resilience have a way of shining through." The audience erupted into applause, their energy invigorating the moment. Richard, however, remained unimpressed. He tapped his pen against his clipboard, as if calculating his next move. "Perseverance, huh?" he said, his tone laced with skepticism. "That's a word we hear a lot these days. But let's be real here, Elijah. It's not every day someone from your background gets to sit where you're sitting. Don't you think there's more to the story than just hard work?" Elijah's smile didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. Amusement, annoyance, whatever it was, he didn't let it show. He leaned slightly forward, his voice unwavering. "You're absolutely right," he said calmly. "There's always more to the story. But if I may ask, what exactly are you implying?" Richard chuckled, crossing his legs as if settling in for a long debate. "Oh, I'm not implying anything," he said, his voice dripping with mock innocence. "I'm just saying that in an industry dominated by, let's say, a certain demographic, your rise to the top is nothing short of extraordinary, almost improbable." The air in the room shifted. A murmur rippled through the audience, subtle but noticeable. Elijah took a moment before responding, his hands resting loosely on his lap. He exhaled slowly before speaking, his voice as steady as ever. "It is extraordinary," he agreed, "and I don't take it for granted. But improbable? No, I think it's a testament to what happens when opportunities are met with preparation and effort." Richard arched a brow, clearly unimpressed with his response. "Preparation and effort," he repeated, almost scoffing. "Do you think that's the whole picture, though? Or do you think certain programs, affirmative action for example, might have given you a little push?" The audience gasped. A few audible whispers broke the silence. Richard's words had crossed a line, but he delivered them with a nonchalance that only heightened their sting. Elijah took a slow breath, the weight of his words settling over him. He could feel the eyes of the audience, the camera crew, and the millions watching at home, waiting to see how he would respond. "I appreciate you bringing that up," he said after a beat, his voice as composed as ever. Because it allows me to address a misconception that people often have about success, particularly mine. But before I answer, let me ask you something, Richard. Would you say the same thing to a guest who didn't look like me? The room went silent. Richard's smile faltered for the first time, a flicker of unease passing over his face before he quickly recovered. He cleared his throat before speaking. Well, Elijah, he said defensively, I ask tough questions to all my guests. It's my job. But the crack in his armor had already shown, and Elijah wasn't about to let the moment slip by. He was just warming up. I understand your job is to ask tough questions, he began, his tone as measured as ever. But when you frame my success as improbable, or suggest that external factors rather than my work ethic got me here, it makes me wonder, would you question someone else's success with the same assumptions? Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Elijah continued, his words cutting through the atmosphere like a blade. See, Richard, I've been in rooms where people assume I don't belong. I've had to prove myself 10 times over just to get half the recognition. And even then, there's always someone ready to attribute my achievements to anything but my capabilities. The murmurs in the audience grew louder. A woman in the front row folded her arms, visibly displeased with Richard's line of questioning. A man in the back shook his head, his arms crossed as he whispered something to the person next to him. Elijah glanced at the crowd briefly, reading the room, before turning back to Richard with a calm but resolute expression. Now, don't get me wrong, he said, his voice softening just slightly, though his words carried unmistakable weight. I'm not saying programs like affirmative action haven't helped level the playing field for people like me. They've been necessary because the playing field was never even to begin with. But the idea that I'm here solely because of a handout, that diminishes years of relentless effort, late nights, and sacrifices that people like me have to make just to get a seat at the table. He leaned slightly forward, holding Richard's gaze. Do you know how many times I had to prove I belonged in rooms where no one expected me? How many deals I had to close before people took me seriously? The truth is, no one handed me anything. I earned this, just like anyone else. And to suggest otherwise, that's not just inaccurate, it's insulting to everyone who has ever had to fight for their place in this world. Richard's expression hardened, his polished veneer slipping. I'm not erasing anything, he said, his voice sharper now. I'm just pointing out the realities of how certain opportunities come about. Would you deny that your background, your story, has played a role in the media's fascination with you? Elijah paused, a small smile playing on his lips. Of course, my story plays a role, he said, nodding slightly. But that's because my story is one of resilience, not favoritism. People resonate with it because it reflects a truth they see in their own lives, that no matter the obstacles, success is possible if you don't give up. The audience erupted into applause, some even rising to their feet. Richard looked momentarily stunned, but Elijah wasn't finished. The greatest challenge isn't proving others wrong, he said, his voice carrying an undeniable authority. It's proving yourself right.